My name is Dennis Pamlin, and together with Jay Hennessy, who's also here, we are working on the Mission Innovations Net Zero Compatible Innovation Initiative, which is under the Mission Innovation. So, and I'm going to talk here about changing the agenda from problem to services, from problem to opportunities. And let me see if I can get the presentation going. So, so I'll do this for now because I have a huge echo. So please give me a shout out in the chat or something if you can't hear, because otherwise I get a huge echo. So basically, the basic framing is super simple. It's a situation when we have one planet and soon going to have 11 billion people. And right now, we are in a system where the supply of solutions are growing and there are progress happening, but the requirement, the demand for solutions is growing even faster. So the problem is getting increasingly bigger, but the solution is not even keeping up. So relatively, we're getting more and more problem. And nowhere else is that more apparent than in the climate field. So we basically we need 60 gigatons of climate innovation solutions. And that's what we have tried to do instead of what most people do, talk about climate change as a problem and how we should reduce emissions at different places. We try to see what kind of needs do we have in society and how can we provide solutions to those. So instead of asking how a fast fashion or fast food provider can slightly reduce their emissions, we can ask how should we dress in the future in a sustainable way, or what is sustainable nutrition in the future. Instead of asking how should a steel plant reduce their emissions, is what is the needs that we currently use steel for, and are there other ways? And a lot of this is just a way of using the fourth industrial revolution in a smarter way. So how can we provide the needs in fundamentally different ways? And that's what we try to do. And it's an interesting journey, and that's a little bit of a few slides that I will talk to you about. Because when we talk about innovation, when we talk about the use of AI, crowdsourcing, etc., so much of those fancy words is basically just used to dig deeper where we already are. So there's a lot of discussions, but we make a slightly better car, or we make many end-of-pipe solutions. And what we try to do is say, how can we create a framework that allows us to look for new ways, really? And that should be innovation. And that's why we sometimes also make a distinction between incremental, disruptive, and transformative innovation, depending on how different the solution is and how much of the underlying infrastructure. And, well, you can look in that in many different ways. But a car, for instance, you can make that incrementally better by going from a fossil car to an electric car. But you can also have a more disruptive change when you actually ask, do I need the car, or should I have a drone or a bike? Or you can go transformative and really ask, what is the access that is needed? Should we use a 3D printer or virtual meetings? And so much of our current innovation ecosystem and solution providers is stuck in the incremental part. You basically do, and much of the regulations, so if you have environmental labels, you have taxations, best in class, many of those approaches are very much about a slightly less bad version of what we already have. But now, with the COVID-19, I think we could safely say that this is the last opportunity we have for 1.5 future, because the kind of initiatives, the kind of innovations we will now accelerate, and the kind of challenges, how we frame the challenge, will put the directions of where we are. So it's really, we have like 18 months now to really put our things together. Then, of course, we can still, regardless of what happened, we still need to reduce emissions. But if we really want to reach 1.5 and do that in a sustainable way, we don't have that much time. And it's just pure math, because we almost have no extra carbon to emit until we're sort of over those tipping points. And that requires fundamental rethinking. And that's what we hope, and that's what we engage in these kind of processes, because we hope here we have people with ideas and solutions in the broader sense of the word, not just technologies, but also new business models, but also procurement ideas or demands that you can put forward. And just to take a step back, and it's just interesting to realize that if you're a company, before 2015, you basically just had your scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and then you do your offsetting. It was all about the problem, and the kind of the financial system, NGOs were very much about trying to get the problem there. But at 2015 in Paris, mission innovation was created. That's not the only thing, but I think there was a little bit of a shift in time when people say, hang on, why are we just talking about problems all the time? Why not talk about solutions? It's basically the same thing, but we broaden the agenda. Instead of inviting those who are the big polluters, let's bring in the next generation of solution providers. And that's where we also wanted to provide one key thing, a way to measure positive impact. Some of you might be quite surprised that there's still not a generally agreed framework and system for calculating your positive impact. So if you have a video conference equipment like the one we use now, the current way you do things, scope 1, 2, and 3, is see the problems you have through the computer, how it was produced, etc. There is no way to report how much do you save by allowing people to meet in a new smart way. So that's one of the first things we brought together in saying, can you quantify some of these possible positive contribution? But that was not enough, because if we talk about system transformation, we can't just look at the quantified emission reductions. First of all, because many of the deeper, fast reductions are lock-in, so you can have, you go from a fossil car or a gasoline car to a natural gas car, or you go from a coal power plant to a natural gas plant, or you claim you are like a hamburger or burger provider, and then you offset your business and say, I'm climate positive. Then you also need to say that's, you can't just have creative book accounting. You need to see, are you 1.5 compatible? So we also developed a framework to see, our company's business model, can they carry all the way? So that's what we try to do now, and also make sure that it's not just climate, because if you just solve the climate issue, you will have many times very resource intensive solutions. And that's not possible for many others, biodiversity, but also just bringing people out of poverty. There's not enough planets for us to be resource inefficient. Even if we solve the climate challenge, then we will not be able to bring people out of poverty. So, thanks for the comment on being climate neutral. And usually what many people then talk about being climate neutral is, in the worst case, they do offsetting. So they don't have a business model. They don't provide what is needed in a carbon neutral and that's why they usually don't call it fossil free. They call it carbon neutral. But sometimes, even if they do that in such a resource inefficient way, or just push a lot of renewable energy into that, so that will not be enough food or biodiversity for us to go around. So what we try to do then is to say, we need to look at a new way on the innovation ecosystem. We need to see how it's not just about getting technology, but also business models that are truly sustainable. And also that it's not just enough for them to be climate friendly in some general sense. They need to be 1.5 compatible. And by that, it basically means that you need to be able to provide this service for 11 billion people. And just think about that. It's really strange that we live in a situation with a lot of people claiming carbon neutrality and doing offsetting, or saying they're carbon neutral and we're going to be 100% renewable, without saying, is this possible for a world with 11 billion people? Or is this an idea with just a few rich people can use this solution? So it's really, really strange. And part of us now, I'm living in Sweden, and I would say that 98% of our green things are not globally sustainable. They're slightly less bad version of what we have. And this is a huge shift. And I think to some extent we shouldn't be too harsh. I'm also from the environmental movement originally. And I think when we started the ideas, it was, companies did not accept that climate was an issue, and policymakers were not aware. So any step in the right direction was celebrated. But now when people fully understand, or more fully understand, what we need to do, we need to understand that so many of our tools, the environmental labels, the taxation ideas, are for incremental improvements in existing systems. They are not for system transformations. And that's what we also talk about, the need to bring all the stakeholders together. We can't just push individual technologies or solutions. We need to bring markets so we can get clusters of new solutions. And we need to have investors who are willing to be part of this journey and discuss how do we make this profitable. We don't want a separate little small green thing that I sometimes talk about the body shop dilemma. You can't have a business model that is nice and greener, but it's basically just trying to cater for a small group in society that is willing to pay a premium. You might do that if the idea is then to roll it out broadly, but so much of what the finance sector do, what many companies do, is to have a niche product and say, we have a green fund. We allow people to choose a green fund. Well, that's very nice, but it's not like we can choose to survive or not. So green, we need to understand that that is an existential threat. It's not an option to be green. You can be a leader for green, but you should not think of this as a separate brand that you sell to a certain group of people. Everything needs to be green or sustainable. So if you then look at this, and yes, I think I shouldn't be too hard. I talk about the body shop dilemma at our time and age. I think Anita and I was actually working with her back at the time when she was alive. She did a lot of good things of showing that companies could even think about these things. So I don't want to say that what she did was really bad, but I think this is also a good example of where people now try to mimic what Body Shop did 20, 25 years ago, but then they still do these sort of niche products. So sorry, it's really good if you have comments and you just put it up in the feed, because it's just make it a little bit more interactive. So what we try to do now is also to develop frameworks so you can see what is it that you actually do as a company, as a policymakers, when you talk about climate and sustainability. Are you trying just to communicate? Are you trying to get the bad companies to reduce their emissions? Are you trying to be more on the supply side and get more renewables out on the market? Or are you trying to get those system solutions up and running? And thanks also for all the LinkedIn invitations. I'm not able to respond to those now, even though my clock is buzzing. So I'll come back to those later. So it's really about your role and the kind of sustainability we want. And I want, in a thought leadership forum like this, I would also like to stress that some people have been talking about science-based climate targets, for instance. That's a really weird thing because there is no really science-based target. You can science-inspired, but the targets we have are ethical and political. There's no science can tell us the implications, but it's our judgment that says this. For instance, we used to say that 2 degrees was acceptable. Now people talk about 1.5. In the report that I have up right now, I argue that if you're science and ethically based, I think most of you would argue that 1 degree is more than we should accept, because that's basically going to kill a lot of our coral reefs around the world and do huge problems for biodiversity and human suffering around the world. But many people say that is impossible to reach. Yeah, so might be, but we should be clear that what we are trying to do now is damage management. We basically too late to do what we should have done, but that should also make us more inspired to do things urgently. So it's not like we have a carbon budget and a lot of time to wait and do a transition. We need to think transformative. So, and I think a lot of this is about living in 2 worlds. And so it's sort of my end of this session will focus a little bit on this schizophrenia almost, that we talk about the 4th industrial revolution and all these new ideas, but almost all our tools and all the way we communicate about leadership and climate solutions and sustainability is in the old way of sort of have a green option, etc. And I think that there's a fundamental challenge in this. And I usually use a very simple graph then to see, and it's not like you live in one world or another, but just this way of, if you are a problem-based stakeholder and you look at a car, and then you look at this go to biofuel car or maybe an electric car, or you can share that and have a carpool, or maybe even self-driving cars. But your mind is still there that you need cars. Instead of asking, what is the access, the mobility, virtual or physical, that is needed? So besides an electric car, where's drones or laptops? Or why, should we even have the idea of cars? Should that die? And maybe what we should think about is storage of a smart system. So, and then on that storage, if that is hydrogen or electricity in a battery, then you put wheels on that and you can go to different parts of the system. But the very foundation of that is sort of an intelligent part of a nature-based system. So you don't really start from a car, you start from how can we live in harmony with nature and think very cleverly on this system. And then you realize that all in sort of internal combustion engines are so stupid. It's just so stupid. And because the resource efficiency, but it's all more fundamentally also its role as a backup system, as being an integrated part of some system, it's just gone. But if you have hydrogen or electricity through a battery, you can have that as an integrated part. Yeah, a future fit business, as someone was asking about, yes, they are starting to move towards the solution agenda. They started, as many others, just as a pure, how do you make sure that your scope 1, 2, and 3, your problem parts? I think they've been starting to try to look what future fit business, but almost all those systems are based on ESG reporting and that sort of traditional guilt-based and problem-based approach. It's not that the future fit business is, I don't really care what you do, it's just you do it in a good way. While we start in the other way, instead of saying, what is that you do? And then make sure that you do it in a good way. But the core focus is what the company is meant to do, not how it's done. And I think that's a little bit on the leadership you see today. Many of the leaders are sort of fast food, fast fashion, which most people would argue that their fundamental business model is just unsustainable. But they've been celebrated because they are then future-proofing themselves through more renewable energy or more renewable materials or some recycling. But the fact that they are trying just to increase consumption and basically not empower people, but disempower people to become consumers is not really been part of that. So I think that is also super interesting in terms of what kind of companies are helping us to become, if the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, are trying to make us become better people. And how many of them are only looking at us as consumers? The only relation to us they have is through as consumer. And this is where I think also for us, everyone who's working with this needs to have a graph like this handy. Because if you want to do something, if you're going to do incremental improvements, you're going to see certain result almost directly. But if you're going to do something that is transformative, very often it's going to take some time. Sometimes it might even cost, because people are going to drive with their cars back and forth to work while you invest in a smarter virtual platforms, ensuring that everybody has a high quality laptop, etc., so they can work more flexible. So initially, you might actually have an increased environmental impact until you say, now we can go, now we can work together. So this is a challenge that you see immediate results, and it's simple and it's easy to foresee if you do incremental, but it's harder to think. Yes, that's a good question. Why Sweden is on board to some extent. Might have some time to talk about that. Energimyndigheten has been taking the lead. Our energy authority has taken the lead on Sweden as an exporter, together with us and a few others, on a gigaton of solutions. But it's tough because the policymakers are still seeing Sweden as only as a reduction target. We are trying to start to get up there, but it's difficult because it's so entrenched in the way we think. Swedish cities, almost none, or there are some who have been starting to discuss that. They only set reduction targets for reducing. And if they say a positive, it's about carbon capture. It's not about what they give to the world. So it's a very sort of protectionistic and narrow-minded field of view. But it's happening, and I would argue that at least in theory and ideas, it's 10 years old. Until 10 years ago, when people were asked, these are sort of sustainability leaders, the old ESG people, but even them realized that until 10 years ago, you basically had BP, Shell, Dow Chemicals, the big polluters who did something, compared to their ExxonMobils and other counterparts. They were seen as the sustainability leader. Now we have Tesla, Patagonia, IKEA and others who are, IKEA I think is on the fence. Some of them are trying just to do the offsetting. Some of them are thinking about how they actually can create a sustainable society. But the focus is more on companies as a solution providers. And I think that's, operations versus offer. I think that's a O to O. That's really the focus we want to do. And we usually talk about operations, but operation in the broader sense, because it's also the supply chain that you go down on. Sort of through and see how you assess that. But it's really about your impact in society, your value proposition. So that's really interesting that so mentally we seem to be there. And we see also financial stakeholders. Swedish, we're here in Sweden now, our pension funds are still horribly part of the problem, I would argue. They are only divesting and trying to say where they should not invest. They're not strongly pushing and helping, because they should not just not invest. They should invest in the future, but they should also ask their large companies to help the next generation of solution providers. So they should ask for transparency on how they help a new generation of entrepreneurs also to flourish. And this is where I think it's interesting that FTSE Russell, the London Stock Exchange, they've been saying ESG, how companies operate, as you say, but then also what companies manufacture. That is sort of the green revenues. Because what we want really are companies that the more you sell, the better the world becomes. It's not that you reduce your negative impact, but still you see growth as a problem. And that's really, for me, the big distinction, that we need to see which are the companies that should accelerate and sell more and make the world a better place. And some of them, it's not selling more, it's just providing services. If that is sort of vegan lifestyle tips or health tips to be more walkable cities, etc. Many of those might not be high tech, but it's a way of helping inspire people to live better, healthier, and more sustainable lives. And that I think is also another shift, that it's not just on the tech side, it's more on the business model innovation, the way we inspire people to live better lives, or companies to become better. So I'll just end with that and say that it looks like it's a draft idea still, so it's not anything official, but being among thought leaders, I wanted to say that if things goes according to plan, so Q4 now or Q1, we will launch a digital web platform together with UNFCCC about this solution perspective. And for the first time, the UN then next year in 2021 will have a clear solution agenda. Because even there at the climate meetings, it was, people come there and say, this is how much we have reduced our emissions as cities, as companies, as countries. We want Sweden, cities, Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö, Växjö, companies to say, this is the kind of solutions we have. This is how much we will help the world avoid emissions. These are the services we provide. So that's where I'm going to end. And thank you, Gävleborg. I would love to see that. Love to see if we can help put some numbers on that, and if that is happening. And it doesn't need to be fully there. It's just that if there's any kind of policy that is on this export, and not just export as products, but just ideas can be, or Wikipedia entries that helps others. Anything that shows that you think about spreading your best and next practices to the rest of the world. So please contact me or Jay or Björn or someone else in the team to see if there's anything we can help you with. And well, let's do that. We have a few minutes left. So I don't know if you have any questions that you can put in the chat or ask in another way, and I'll be able to answer. I haven't seen the SDG portal. Most of the SDG work is unfortunately on the supply side work with, and even the UN. I used to be the director for UN Global Compact, And they even call it the dilemma of the SDG post-it work. So with companies, it's just trying to find something to do. And usually in the supply chain, they provide, they help some poor farmers, or they do something, not bad, but it's not really the core business. It's not why they exist. And then they say, oh, now we do some water work, we do some renewable work, and it's SDG related. And you should also, I shouldn't be too cynical, but many of the large companies, they are usually as far away from the core business as they can. So if you are a company doing sneakers and have huge problems with human rights, you tend to look at your climate work, or your fast fashion company or something, you highlight those things. And if you're car companies, you might look at your gender work. Not to say that those are important, they're super important, but it's not really maybe the biggest challenge they face in terms of sustainability. Although they can do that to sort of spread the knowledge, but we need to also understand that where the biggest challenges are and where they really need to act. Yes, Swedish culture, I think, is something of a challenge. I sometimes say, I don't know if some of you are Swedish, if you've seen Henrik Schyffert's about the 90s. And he talks about that people dress the way when they think they're the coolest. So Ulf Lundell, a Swedish musician, he will always dress as if it's the 60s. And I think Sweden's sustainability work, we're so proud of our end-of-pipe 70s work that we haven't really came out of that and thought about global sustainability and innovation and celebrate Spotify, Skype, and sort of the people who've helped us to live newer, smarter lives. So instead we look at the, renewable energy and tech fixes to old industries. So it's a little bit of a culture change. I think it's changing now, and with stakeholders like Swedish Energy Agency, etc. I think we're on a good track, and there are a couple of cities also going around. But also, I think when we go to India, like we've done in our project, Chile and India are core partners, and for them it's obvious. We need to have global sustainable solutions. We need to think about resource efficiency. We need to allow people to move out of poverty. So I think sometimes the challenge also in Sweden is that we think about the rich middle class as the reference point, not really the global population and what is needed for them. The fat and happy challenge. I'll steal that from you, Anna, if that's okay. So, yeah. So I don't know if you saw that, it was in the chat box. Yeah, Project Drawdown, we've done some there. And I think they've done some interesting work. The challenge with Drawdown is also that when you do these things, and we use some of that as a reference, is that you also need to look at system solutions. Because every time you're trying to separate things into small boxes to help people think, you inevitably come to the challenges to say that, how do we bring this together? Because it's really when you have a walkable city that is healthy, decentralized, nature-based, and that is not single solutions. It's when you bring those together that you really deliver. And that is really a fundamental challenge for us, how we move away from these sort of single solutions and list that these are the most inexpensive and most sort of important challenge. We get that all the time. And we are partly guilty of that also, of course. We bring 1,000 solutions, but we also try to group them and say that you can look at them from this perspective, but you can also cluster them depending on needs. And you can do this in different ways. So we try to move away from that, but it's super difficult. So if someone has ideas on how to really embark on a system change journey, and how do you not just talk about that and wave your arms, but also link that to investors, cities that should have strategies for this. So I think that's where we end. Thanks everyone for participating. And hello, Lars, one of the heroes pushing for all these solutions. Good to see you here. Thanks, and look forward, if there's anyone else, look forward to be in touch with you. Thank you. Have a fantastic weekend.